A black doctor just saved a life. But when he steps into a cafe, everything changes. Dr. Marcus Reed had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift in the ER, where he had saved the life of a young boy after a near-fatal accident. He was exhausted but relieved, ready to grab a coffee before heading home. But the moment he stepped into the cafe, everything changed. A barista hesitated before serving him. Customers exchanged glances. And then, a security guard approached. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave." Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" The guard's face remained blank. "We had a complaint." Marcus looked around. No one spoke. But everyone was watching. He wasn't being asked. He was being removed. He had spent the last 12 hours saving lives. And now, in the span of 12 seconds, he was being treated like a criminal. What happened next would shock everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airport was a place where everyone was supposed to be equal. At least, that's what they told you. It was a place of movement, of arrivals and departures, where men and women of all kinds stood in line together, emptied their pockets together, and shuffled through metal detectors together. But Naomi Evans had long since learned that being allowed in a space and being welcome in it were not the same thing. She felt it in the stiffness of the agent's smile when she approached the first-class counter. Ticket in hand. She felt it in the way the woman at security examined her ID for too long, holding it up to the light, as if something about her face did not quite belong to the name on the paper. And she felt it again now, in the silence that stretched just a second too long when she stepped onto the plane, her pregnant belly pressing against the fabric of her dress. A small but undeniable reminder that she carried life inside her. But the world was already asking if it was too much. She knew what they saw. A black woman in first class. A black woman moving through a space that, for some people, still did not seem to fit her. She saw it in the glance from the flight attendant at the front of the plane. A woman in her late 40s with neat blonde hair and a stiff uniform that looked as though it had been ironed into her skin. The woman's name tag read Clara Thompson. But Naomi already knew her without needing to be introduced. She had met Clara before. She had met her in high-end department stores, where she had been asked, "Can I help you?" But what they meant was, "Do you belong here?" She had met her in restaurants, when the waitress's smile had been just a little too tight, when her bill had been dropped at the table a little too quickly. As if it had been decided already that she was not the kind of woman who lingered over dessert. And now, she was meeting her again. Here, at 35,000 feet before the flight had even taken off. The first test came before she even reached her seat. She reached up, lifting her small carry-on into the overhead bin. And just as she secured it, she heard the voice. That should have been checked at the gate. It was not a question. It was not a suggestion. It was a decision that had already been made without her consent. Naomi turned, the weight of Clara's stare pressing against her. The kind of stare that dared her to ask why. For a moment, she thought about apologizing, about saying something easy and simple, something that would make this moment pass without incident. But then she saw the way Clara was already looking past her, already dismissing her, moving on to the next passenger as if Naomi's presence had been a mistake from the beginning. And something in her refused to shrink. "I didn't check it at the gate because I didn't need to," Naomi said evenly. "It fits just fine." Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture tightened. Then, a smile, a thin, unimpressed thing. "Just try to keep the aisle clear," Clara said, her voice clipped, before she turned and walked away. The words sat heavy in the air, as if she had already decided Naomi was an inconvenience. A man in a suit, seated in the row across from hers, shifted uncomfortably. He had seen what just happened, but he did what most people did when they saw something unfair. But not unfair enough to intervene. He looked away, and just like that, the moment was gone. But Naomi knew better. It was not gone. It was just the beginning. Because she had seen this story before. And it never ended with just one test. It always escalated. The only question was, when? And how much of herself she would be expected to give before the world decided to listen. The air inside the plane felt thicker than it should have. The quiet murmur of passengers settling in. The overhead compartments clicking shut. The familiar hiss of the air vents. All of it was normal. But nothing felt normal. Naomi could feel the moment sitting on her skin like a second layer. The kind that would not wash away easily. Clara had moved on, her stiff uniform disappearing down the aisle. But Naomi knew better than to believe this was over. Because the thing about power, the thing about people who believed themselves to be gatekeepers of space, of order, of who belonged and who did not, was that they never liked being challenged. Not by someone like her. Not by a black woman who did not shrink when told to. The first warning came sooner than she expected. Naomi had just begun to settle into her seat, adjusting the small pillow behind her back, when she felt a dull ache crawl up her spine. She reached for the call button above her seat, pressing it lightly. It was nothing, really, just water, just a small request. A moment later, Clara appeared again. There was no question in her expression, only impatience. Yes? Not, how can I help you? Not, what do you need? Just, yes? Naomi swallowed, keeping her voice level. Could I have a glass of water? Please? I'm feeling a little faint. Clara exhaled loudly, not even trying to hide it this time. If you're not feeling well, she said, her voice rising just enough for the rows nearby to hear. Maybe you shouldn't be flying. And just like that, the temperature in the cabin dropped. The moment stretched, growing bigger than the sum of its parts. A man in a business suit 2 rows up turned slightly, glancing over the edge of his seat. A young couple stopped whispering. But no one spoke. No one ever did. Naomi's grip on the armrest tightened. She could have let it pass. She could have lowered her eyes, muttered it's fine, never mind, and let Clara feel she had won something. But she was tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. So she met Clara's eyes and said, calmly, precisely, I just need water. And there it was. The smallest thing in the world. A cup of water. But Naomi had made the mistake of asking for it while black. She had made the mistake of needing something in a space where she was already too visible. Too inconvenient. Clara stared at her for a beat too long. Her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Not in a hurry, not embarrassed. Just deciding, deliberately, that Naomi was beneath the courtesy of a response. The moment sat heavy in the air. The man in the business suit adjusted his tie, looking down at his lap. The young couple across the aisle exchanged glances. Uncomfortable. And Naomi sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Then 5. Clara did not return. She had not forgotten. She was waiting for Naomi to fold first. She was waiting for her to press the call button again. To signal to the entire plane that she was difficult. That she was making a fuss. That she was one of those people who always had a problem. And Naomi sat there, not moving, not flinching, not giving her the satisfaction. Her throat was dry. Her back arched. And still, she waited. Because dignity was not always comfortable. Because some fights were fought in silence. 7 minutes later, the water arrived. Not from Clara. A different flight attendant. A younger woman with softer features. Nervous eyes. And a quiet awareness that something was wrong. She knelt slightly, lowering her voice. I'm so sorry for the wait. Ma'am. Naomi took the water, nodding once in thanks. She did not say, it's okay. Because it wasn't. And she knew, without having to turn around, that Clara was watching her from the front of the plane. Waiting. Measuring. Because the thing about racism. About this kind of racism. The kind that lived in the polite spaces. In the spaces where people smiled while telling you to move. Where they used their uniforms as armor and their authority as a weapon. Was that it was never just about what was said. It was about what was denied. It was about who was expected to endure. And for how long. And Naomi knew. She knew it was not over yet. It never was. Not with people like Clara. Because when a black woman does not fold, does not shrink, does not submit, they always find another way. The thing about power, the thing about who holds it, who bends to it, and who is crushed beneath it, is that it is never just about what is done. It is about what is allowed to happen. And Naomi Evans, sitting in her first-class seat, her hands still cold from the untouched glass of water, understood that she was being measured. She knew that Clara Thompson, with her stiff uniform and tighter smile, had marked her the moment she stepped onto the plane. She knew that a black woman asking for something she had already paid for, a seat, a service, a simple sliver of dignity, was always at risk of being labeled a problem. And she knew, more than anything, that this was not over yet. It never was. Because Clara had lost the last round. And people like her never liked to lose. The next move. The first sign came in the form of silence. Naomi had expected Clara to press again. To push harder. To make another comment that would force her to choose between dignity and survival. But Clara had learned something. She had learned that Naomi would not be broken by words alone. So now, she would do something quieter. Something calculated. Something that would make Naomi the problem without Clara ever having to say it aloud. It happened mid-flight, when Naomi felt the familiar discomfort in her lower back. A dull ache that pressed against her spine. She shifted in her seat, exhaling slowly. She had been sitting for too long. She needed to stand, to stretch. Just for a moment, she unbuckled her seatbelt, placed a hand against her belly, and rose carefully from her seat. Across the aisle, a man in a suit glanced up from his tablet but said nothing. The cabin was quiet, passengers lost in their books, their music, the dull hum of the engines. And then, "Ma'am, I need you to sit down." The voice was sharp, immediate. Naomi turned, and there was Clara, standing at the front of the cabin. Her posture too straight, too ready. Her voice carried, loud enough for passengers in the rows behind to hear. "You need to be seated." Naomi blinked, confused. "We're not experiencing turbulence," she said, her voice measured. Clara's expression did not change. "It's against policy for passengers to stand near the aisles for extended periods of time." Extended periods of time. Naomi had been standing for less than 30 seconds. A man 3 rows ahead was still standing, casually stretching his arms before settling back into his seat. A flight attendant a few rows back was chatting with another passenger, laughing softly. And yet, Naomi was the one being told to sit down. The logic didn't matter. The policy didn't matter. What mattered was that Clara had chosen her. Naomi inhaled deeply, exhaled even slower. "I just need to stretch my legs for a moment," she said. "That shouldn't be a problem." Clara's lips curled into something almost smug. "It is when it makes other passengers uncomfortable." The bystanders. The moment expanded. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some turned their heads toward Naomi. Then away. Then back again. Others stared straight ahead, not wanting to be part of it. Not wanting to know. The man in the suit, the one who had been watching earlier, adjusted his tie but said nothing. The woman in the floral blouse, seated across from Naomi, stiffened. It was happening again. And it was not about policy. It was not about the rules. It was about something deeper. Something Clara would never have to name aloud. It was about who was allowed to move freely and who was expected to stay put. It was about who was given grace and who had to ask for permission to exist. Naomi could feel the familiar pressure pressing against her chest. The pressure to comply, to shrink, to sit down and make it all go away. She could feel the weight of their eyes, their hesitation, their complicity. She could feel the trap closing in around her. The unwritten rule. Naomi had 2 choices. She could sit down, say nothing, and let Clara win. She could let this be another moment where a black woman was forced to accept less, to endure more, to pretend that she had not been targeted even when everyone around her knew she had. Or, she could make them see. She could hold the silence in her hands and force them to sit with it. To feel it, to know what it meant to watch someone be stripped of dignity in real time. She could stand. Naomi did not move. She stood there, quiet, still, unwavering. The silence grew heavier. The tension wrapped around the cabin, thick and inescapable. Clara's eyes flickered, just for a second, the first crack in her certainty. She had expected Naomi to fold. She had expected Naomi to bow her head and sit down. the way so many before her had. But Naomi was still standing. And now everyone was watching. The turning point. Is there a problem? The voice came from behind Naomi. Deep and calm. A man in first class, his presence heavy with authority, leaned forward in his seat, watching Clara carefully. The woman in the floral blouse turned, her expression sharp. Because I'm pretty sure she has every right to stand if she needs to. A young man with a phone in his hand raised it slightly. Recording. Clara realized, too late, that she had pushed too far. The room was shifting, the weight of all those silent witnesses beginning to press back against her. She straightened, her expression suddenly unsure. Ma'am, I'm just enforcing policy, she said, but her voice was weaker now. Naomi tilted her head slightly, watching her. Then I assume you've told the gentleman 3 rows up the same thing. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. The woman in the floral blouse smirked, shaking her head. I think you should move on now, she said simply. Clara hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned and walked away. Aftermath. Naomi did not move for another 5 seconds. Then, finally, she exhaled and sat back down. Not because she had been told to, but because she had decided to. A voice behind her whispered, "Good for you." The woman in the floral blouse leaned over the aisle and said, "She won't forget that." Naomi smiled faintly. "Neither will I." And somewhere, near the front of the plane, Clara stood stiffly near the galley, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw set tight, because the worst thing you could ever do to people like her was let them know they had been seen. And Naomi had made sure she had. The moment had passed, but the air still vibrated with it. Naomi sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had won this round. She knew that. But winning, when you were black in America, never came without cost. There was always a price. And she could feel it coming. Because Clara was not done. The weight of a wound. There was something about being humiliated in public. Something about knowing that eyes had seen you be wronged and that most of those eyes had chosen to do nothing. Naomi could feel it in her bones. The silent understanding that some people on this plane were hoping she'd stay quiet now. That she had already gotten more resistance than most would have dared. That maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it go. Because that was how these things worked. You didn't let it consume you. You didn't let it ruin the mood of the room. You accepted the wound, ignored the sting, and convinced yourself that you should be grateful it wasn't worse. Naomi wasn't playing that game. She knew the rules too well to pretend they weren't written against her. The next play. The flight dragged on. Outside, clouds rolled past the small window. Weightless, unconcerned. Inside, time moves differently. Naomi saw Clara moving up and down the aisle, smiling at passengers, performing the role of attentive service for everyone except her. She could feel the absence of attention as clearly as she had felt its presence before. Clara didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her, and that, Naomi knew, was deliberate. Because the thing about people like Clara, people who understood power not as a responsibility, but as a weapon, was that if they couldn't break you with force, they would break you with silence. The opportunity came an hour later, when the drink service rolled through the aisle. Naomi didn't want anything. She wasn't thirsty. She didn't need another tense interaction. But she had already paid for this seat, just like everyone else. And she had already let one denial stand. She wasn't about to let another. The cart rolled closer. The flight attendant, not Clara, but another woman, younger, nervous, offered a warm smile to the man beside Naomi. "Anything to drink, sir?" The man nodded. "Coffee, black." The young flight attendant poured the coffee without hesitation, smiling as she handed it to him. Then she turned to Naomi. The smile faltered. "And for you, ma'am?" Naomi saw her hesitation, the brief flicker of uncertainty, the small glance toward the front of the plane, where Clara stood, watching. And that was the test. Not from Naomi, from Clara. Because this wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about who else would carry out the work for her. Would this younger woman, still uncertain in her authority, still eager to prove herself, Choose power over principle? Would she deny Naomi something as simple as a drink? Not because she wanted to, but because she had been shown that there were no consequences in doing so? Would she stand at the edge of that decision, knowing it was wrong, but convincing herself that it was not her fight? Naomi watched her, waited, and then, "Water is fine," Naomi said, her voice even. The young flight attendant's shoulders eased. She poured the water quickly, placing it on Naomi's tray. No hesitation, no comment, no insult. And just like that, Clara lost again. The breaking point. Naomi sipped her water slowly, letting the moment stretch. She didn't look toward the front. She didn't need to. She felt Clara's frustration without ever seeing it. Because this was not how the story was supposed to go. Naomi was supposed to be angry. She was supposed to be rude, disruptive, and difficult. She was supposed to be the problem. And yet, here she was, sitting quietly, being served just like everyone else. It was Clara who had made herself into the spectacle. And that was the thing people like her never saw coming. That was the thing they feared most. Not a black woman who yells, who fights, who causes a scene, but a black woman who simply refuses to break. The audience reacts. Naomi heard the whispers before she saw the shift. A woman in the row behind her muttered something low. A middle-aged man near the window adjusted his glasses, looking toward Clara, then back at Naomi. Someone, a young man 2 rows up, lifted his phone slightly, angling it toward the aisle. The moment was not small anymore. It had grown, taken shape, settled into the room, and for the first time, Naomi could feel the weight shifting. She was no longer alone in this. People were watching, and they were not watching her. They were watching Clara, watching her fail to control the moment, watching her own the humiliation she had tried to hand out, watching her lose. When the mask slips, Clara's voice returned minutes later. Sharp, forced, artificial. She moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, her movements too stiff. When she reached Naomi's row, she paused just slightly, not long enough to speak, just long enough to send a message. Naomi looked up, meeting her gaze, and there, finally, at last, was something real in Clara's eyes. Not power, not certainty, but fear, because she had lost control. Because the thing about power, the thing about who holds it, who bends to it, and who is crushed beneath it, is that it is only as strong as the silence around it. And today, Naomi had shattered the silence. There was something about a wound that wasn't acknowledged. Something about the way it lingered. The way it festered in the quiet spaces. That was how racism worked most of the time. Not with fire hoses or burning crosses. Not with fists or slurs screamed in the streets. No, those were too obvious. Too easy to point at and call foul. The real thing. The thing that clung to you. That stained your skin like something oil-based. Something you couldn't quite wash off. Was in the way people acted after the fact. In the way Clara moved now. Stiff and deliberate. Pretending Naomi no longer existed. But Naomi knew what was coming. Because white people like Clara never left a battle unfinished. And when they couldn't win in public, they found ways to get even in the shadows. The undercurrent. The whispers had grown. Passengers who had once kept their heads down were looking now. Shifting in their seats. Stealing glances toward the front of the plane. Some were murmuring about what had already happened. The water. The seatbelt. The moment Naomi had stood her ground. But some were murmuring about what was happening now. Because Clara was moving with a purpose. She wasn't serving anymore. She wasn't checking on passengers. She was walking to the front of the plane. Toward the cockpit. Toward the people with the real authority. And Naomi felt it before she even saw it. That sudden weight in the air. The moment when a conflict slips out of your hands. When it becomes something bigger than you. Something other people will now decide the outcome of. This was the next move. This was how the game was always played. The setup. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Naomi sat still, staring out the window. But she could feel the shift around her. Clara had not returned. But the captain had made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation as we work to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. There was no direct mention of Naomi. But it didn't have to be. She had been on enough flights. lived through enough days like this to know when she was being set up. Because that's how white authority functioned when it wanted to move in silence. It spoke through vague policies, through calm voices, through polite requests that were never really requests at all. The announcement. 15 minutes later, another voice. Not the captain this time. A flight attendant over the intercom. Would the passenger in seat 3A please remain seated? A member of the flight crew will be with you shortly. There was no accusation in the words. No hostility. Just a simple instruction. But Naomi understood exactly what it meant. Because when people like Clara lost in public, they made sure to win in private. And Naomi knew, with every fiber of her being, that the moment she landed, she would be met at the gate. By security. By polite men with soft voices and hard eyes. Men who would ask her to step aside. To answer a few questions. To explain why she had been a disruption on this flight. And Naomi, pregnant, exhausted, already drained from the weight of this battle, would have to make a choice. The choice. She could stay quiet. She could let it happen. Let them pull her aside. Let them make a scene out of her. Let them decide whether she was safe enough to let go or hostile enough to detain. Or she could force their hand now. She could refuse to be silent. Refuse to let Clara disappear into the background while the consequences fell on Naomi alone. She could make sure everyone saw exactly what was happening in real time. She took a deep breath. And then, for the first time since this all started, she turned to face the entire cabin. The turning point. Excuse me. Her voice wasn't raised. But it didn't have to be. Because the weight in it, the deliberate way she said those two words, cut through the air like a sharp blade. People turned. Passengers who had been murmuring stopped. The man in the suit lowered his tablet. The woman in the floral blouse leaned forward slightly. Watching. Naomi turned in her seat. Making sure she was facing Clara directly now. Did you just report me to the captain? A murmur swept through the rows. Because it was out in the open now. There was no hiding behind policies. Behind vague concerns about disruption. Naomi had pulled the thread. And now Clara had to answer for what she'd done. The unraveling. Clara hesitated. She hadn't expected this. She had expected Naomi to sit quietly and take it. To accept the coming punishment the way black people had always been expected to. But now? Now Clara had to own her actions in front of an audience. Passengers were watching. Phones were already being lifted. And Clara's mask was slipping. I was just ensuring protocol was followed. She said, her voice tight. Protocol for what? Naomi asked, her tone cool. Because I asked for water? Because I stretched my legs? Someone near the back laughed softly, shaking their head. It was small, but it was enough. Enough to make Clara realize she had lost control. Again. And Naomi saw it in her face. That sudden, sharp realization that she was no longer the one writing the rules here. The passengers weren't looking at Naomi as the problem anymore. They were looking at her. The collapse. Clara's mouth opened and closed. She wanted to fight back. Wanted to win this last round. But she couldn't. Because Naomi had done something Clara never expected her to do. She had exposed the game before it could be played. And now, there was no way to move forward without showing her hand. Clara turned abruptly, marching toward the front of the plane. And Naomi? She leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Because for the first time all flight, she felt in control. The lesson. The thing about racism in America. The thing white people always pretended not to understand. Was that it was not about slurs. Not about laws. Not about, just one bad apple. It was about who was believed first and who was always doubted. It was about who had to prove their right to exist in a space and who was entitled to it without question. And most of all, it was about who was punished for daring to stand up and who was protected when they tore someone down. But this time, for once, Naomi was not the one being punished. And Clara? She would never forget what it felt like to be seen. Because once you were seen for what you really were, there was no hiding again. And Naomi? She would make sure of that. The thing about power, real power, was that it never accepted defeat gracefully. It could be humiliating. It could be exposed. But I will not forget it. And Clara had not forgotten. Naomi knew at the moment she saw the first officer waiting at the gate. Because this was always how it worked. If you were black in America, your victory was never truly yours. It was borrowed time. And sooner or later, the bill always came due. The arrival. The plane had landed. The usual chaos of disembarking was in full swing. People standing too soon, fumbling with overhead compartments, murmuring about connecting flights and rental cars. Naomi stayed seated, not because she was tired, though she was. Not because she didn't want to move, though she didn't. She stayed seated because she could already see the trap waiting for her. Because there, just past the jet bridge, stood a uniformed officer. Not TSA. Not airport security. This was a police officer. And Naomi knew, in the deepest part of her bones, that this was not coincidence. This was Clara's final move. The weight of a gaze. People moved around Naomi, gathering bags, shifting forward in the aisle. But she was no longer in that plane. She was 12 years old again, watching her father be pulled over for the crime of driving while black. She was 22, in a department store, the security guard following her through every aisle. She was every black person in America who had ever been told to just comply, and had still found themselves in cuffs anyway. Because compliance had never been the point. Punishment was. She could feel the man with the phone, a few rows back, watching her now. Could feel the woman in the floral blouse holding her breath. Because everyone on this flight had witnessed what had happened. And now, they were about to see the price she would have to pay for it. The last warning. Naomi reached for her bag. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She told herself, stay calm. She told herself, you did nothing wrong. But that didn't matter. It never had. She could already hear the questions the officer would ask her. We just want to make sure everything's okay. There was a report of a disruptive passenger. Would you mind stepping aside for a moment? It would all be so polite. So reasonable. So carefully designed to make it seem like it wasn't about race at all. And the moment she refused to play along. The moment she questioned why she was the one being stopped and not Clara. Then she would become the problem. Then, suddenly, she would be aggressive, uncooperative, hostile. That was the trap. That was always the trap. And Naomi could feel herself walking straight into it. The witnesses. As she stepped into the aisle, the man with the phone moved, slipping into place just behind her. I got you, he whispered. And Naomi felt something shift. Because for the first time, she realized, this was not just happening to her. This was happening in front of a plane full of people who had already seen Clara for what she was. And now, they were seeing the next step. The cover-up. The retaliation. The punishment that followed every black person who dared to say no. The woman in the floral blouse moved too, stepping forward just slightly, close enough that Naomi could feel her presence. And suddenly, Naomi wasn't alone. The walk. She stepped off the plane. Her feet hit the jet bridge floor, her pulse hammering in her chest. And there he was. The officer. Tall. Calm. Waiting. Ma'am, do you have a moment? The words were so casual. As if she had a choice. As if they weren't already in motion. Setting the narrative before she even had a chance to speak. But before Naomi could respond, the woman in the floral blouse spoke first. Excuse me, officer, but we were on that flight. I think you might be looking for the wrong person. Naomi exhaled slowly. Because this was what Clara had never expected. She had expected Naomi to be isolated. She had expected Naomi to be alone. She had not expected that the people on that plane, the ones who had watched, who had murmured, who had done nothing at first, would now be the ones speaking up. And Naomi saw it in the officer's face. That flicker of hesitation. Because he was used to control. But control was built on silence. And right now, Naomi was not surrounded by silence. She was surrounded by witnesses. The breaking point. The officer's eyes flicked past Naomi, scanning the passengers behind her. More were stepping forward now. A middle-aged black man with a gray beard. A white woman in a business suit. A young Latino teenager clutching a backpack. All of them watching. And Clara? Clara was still inside the plane, watching this moment slip out of her hands. Naomi turned back to the officer. Her voice steady now. I assume I'm free to go? And there it was. The hesitation. Because he had no reason to stop her now. Not with all these eyes on him. Not with a phone still recording. Held steady in the hands of a man who had already made sure the world was watching. Finally, reluctantly, the officer nodded. Have a good day, ma'am. The aftermath. Naomi didn't look back as she walked into the terminal. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift. The weight of what had just happened. Clara had tried to play the game the way it had always been played. But this time, the silence had broken too soon. This time, the people who usually turned away, who pretended not to see, had chosen to see, and that, more than anything else, was what terrified people like Clara the most. Because racism, in its truest form, was not about hate, it was about power, and power only worked when it was invisible. But Naomi had ripped the curtain down. And there was no putting it back up. There was something about the aftermath of a battle that was always heavier than the fight itself. The moment after the dust settled, after the crowd dispersed, when you were left alone with the wreckage, that was where the real war began. Because racism, like all power, was not defeated in a single moment. It adjusted, it adapted, and then it came for you in ways you never saw coming. The waiting room. Naomi sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands resting on her stomach, her body still vibrating from everything that had happened. She had been led to this small, sterile office by an airline representative, a polite man with tired eyes and a notepad. He had offered her water, a seat, and the same scripted line she had heard her whole life. We take these matters very seriously. She didn't believe him, but she sat anyway, because what choice did she have? The shift in power. Outside the glass-walled office, passengers from her flight moved through the airport, disappearing into their own lives. The man with the phone had given her a nod before leaving. The woman in the floral blouse had squeezed her hand. And now, Naomi was alone. The weight of that settled deep in her bones. Because while solidarity had saved her in the moment, she knew, better than anyone, that moment's past. And power? Power never forgot a loss. It just found another way to win. The official statement. Lisa Carter, the director of passenger relations, finally entered. She had the kind of face built for apologies. Serious, lined with concern, but ultimately unshaken. She sat across from Naomi, placing a folder on the table. Miss Williams, she began, her voice gentle, controlled. First, let me say that we sincerely regret what happened on your flight today. The airline does not condone discrimination in any form, and we are committed to ensuring every passenger is treated with dignity and respect. Naomi said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that white people would fill the silence if you let them. Lisa hesitated, then continued, We've spoken with the crew. And we've decided to place the flight attendant in question on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation. Naomi inhaled slowly. Leave, she repeated, her voice cool, measured. Lisa nodded. Yes. Standard procedure in cases like this. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying the woman. Standard procedure. That was a phrase she had heard before. After cops shot unarmed black men. After black employees were fired for attitude problems. After white schools investigated racism complaints from black students and found nothing wrong. And what happens after the investigation? Naomi asked. Lisa hesitated. Well, we will review all statements and make a decision regarding appropriate disciplinary action. Naomi exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. So nothing, she said flatly. Lisa's jaw tightened. I wouldn't say that. But it's what you mean. Lisa didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. The price of speaking up. Naomi knew how this would play out. Clara would be off the schedule for a few weeks. Then she'd be quietly reinstated. Maybe sent to a different flight route where people wouldn't recognize her. Maybe she'd even get a sympathetic article written about her. Something about how cancelled culture was ruining lives. And Naomi? Naomi would be the angry black woman. The one who had made a fuss. The one who was looking for trouble. Because white people, no matter how much they wanted to pretend otherwise, always closed ranks when one of their own was exposed. And power, real power, did not let people like Naomi win. Not for long. The choice. Lisa Carter watched Naomi carefully now. Waiting. Because this was the moment. The moment they always waited for. When the black woman got tired. When she accepted whatever hollow apology was given. When she nodded, said thank you, and let them move on. That's how this story was supposed to end. But Naomi had spent her whole life watching this game play out. And she was done playing by their rules. So instead of nodding, instead of giving Lisa what she wanted, she did something else. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the table. Lisa frowned. What are you? Quote. The video, Naomi said, her voice quiet but firm. Lisa stiffened. Because this was not part of the plan. Naomi tapped the screen, playing the recording, the one the man had taken on the plane. Clara's voice filled the room. The contempt in it, the humiliation in it, the clear and undeniable evidence. Lisa swallowed hard. Miss Williams, I assure you. Quote. No. Naomi interrupted. Lisa frozen. You don't get to assure me of anything. Naomi leaned forward now, her presence filling the space in a way Lisa hadn't expected. Here's what's going to happen. Naomi said. I don't care about your leave. I don't care about your investigation. Clara needs to be fired. Publicly. And the airline needs to release a statement acknowledging exactly what happened on that flight. Lisa hesitated. That's a complicated request. It's not a request. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. Because this wasn't how things worked. Black people weren't supposed to demand anything. They were supposed to ask nicely and take whatever was given. But Naomi wasn't asking. She was forcing their hand. Because that video was already online. And if the airline didn't get ahead of it, the public would make their decision for them. Lisa exhaled slowly. I'll take this to the board. Naomi nodded once. You do that. And with that, she stood, sliding her phone back into her pocket. Because for the first time in this entire fight, she wasn't on the defensive anymore. She was in control. And for people like Lisa, for people like Clara, that was the worst thing she could possibly be. There is a moment, just before justice is done, when power hesitates. It does not hesitate because it is unsure of itself. It hesitates because it is deciding how much of itself it is willing to lose. The airline knew what was at stake. They were not a company built on ethics, but on calculated decisions. And now, for the first time, Naomi had forced them to calculate differently. Because the old equation wasn't working anymore. The weight of history had shifted. The silence had broken. And the world was watching. The final call. Naomi sat in the back seat of the car, her phone resting in her lap. The airport was behind her. But the battle was still very much alive. She had given Lisa Carter and the airline executives 24 hours. Not to apologize. Not to investigate. To act. And for 24 hours, the airline had done what power always did when it was cornered. Stalled. They had released a vague corporate statement. We take passenger concerns very seriously and are conducting a thorough internal review. No names. No admissions. Just words meant to pacify. But the passengers on that plane? The ones who had watched Clara humiliate Naomi. Who had filmed the interaction. Who had shared their own testimonies. They were not pacified. The video had spread beyond anything the airline had anticipated. News outlets picked it up. Public figures started demanding answers. And within a day, the airline's social media was flooded with 3 words they had not expected to see. Fire her now. The breaking point. The phone rang. Naomi glanced at the screen. Lisa Carter. She let it ring once. Twice. Then she answered. Miss Williams. Lisa's voice was carefully composed. But Naomi could hear the strain in it. They had lost control of the story. And they knew it. We wanted to update you on our decision regarding this matter. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. Lisa filled the silence. Just as Naomi knew she would. Clara will no longer be employed with the airline. A pause. We will also be issuing a formal statement acknowledging the events on the flight, as well as announcing new training initiatives for our staff. Naomi exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. There it was. Not a suspension. Not a quiet reassignment. Termination. And with it, the first real admission of guilt. Lisa continued, her voice lighter now, as if she had given Naomi a gift. We appreciate your patience throughout this process and hope this resolution demonstrates our commitment to accountability. Naomi's lips curved into a small, humorless smile. Lisa, she said, her voice even. You didn't fire Clara because it was the right thing to do. Lisa hesitated. Excuse me? You fired Clara because you had no other choice. Silence. Because they both knew it was true. The cost of truth. Naomi should have felt victorious. She had done something that most black people in America never got to do. Win. She had exposed racism, fought back, and forced $1 billion corporation to take action. But victories like these came with a cost. Because power, real power, never forgets. Already, Naomi knew the narratives that would follow. Clara would become a martyr for the fearful and resentful. There would be op-eds about cancel culture gone too far. There would be corporate whispers about Naomi being difficult, about her being a troublemaker. Maybe, one day, she would apply for a job, and a hiring manager would look at her name, remember this moment, and decide she was too much of a risk. That was the price of exposure. Because racism was not just about the moment. It was about what came after. The aftermath. As Naomi ended the call, she noticed a new email in her inbox. It was from the airline. A formal invitation to participate in their Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. She almost laughed. Because of course, this was how it always worked. First, they denied it. Then, they tried to bury it. And when that didn't work, they asked the same black people they had harmed to help them fix it. Naomi shook her head. She wasn't interested in being their consultant. She wasn't interested in helping them clean up their mess. She had already done her part. She had made them see themselves. And that was enough. The lesson they never wanted to learn. That night, Naomi sat in her apartment, scrolling through the messages flooding her phone. Some from strangers, people who had seen the video, who thanked her for speaking up. Some from old friends, people she hadn't heard from in years, reaching out in support. And some from people she had never met but knew all too well. I went through the same thing. I wish I had spoken up. Thank you for standing your ground. And that, more than the firing, more than the airline's statement, was what mattered. Not the victory, not the headlines, but the people who now knew, without a doubt, that they weren't alone. Because that was what power had never wanted. For black people to see themselves not as isolated victims, but as a collective force. For silence to be broken before it could settle. For racism to be called out before it had the chance to retreat back into the shadows. For the next Naomi, whoever she was, wherever she was, to know that when her time came, she would not stand alone. And that, more than anything else, was why Clara had lost. Because in the end, power is only power if people are too afraid to challenge it. And Naomi had taught the world something new. It was possible to say no. It was possible to fight back. And it was possible, just possible to win, even if the victory wasn't clean. Even if the cost was high. Because change, real change, was never comfortable. It was never given. It was always taken. And Naomi had taken hers. One flight, one moment, one undeniable truth at a time. Narrative style and intent. This final chapter closes with realism rather than fantasy. Yes, Clara is fired. Yes, the airline is forced to acknowledge wrongdoing. But the system itself remains intact. Because racism does not disappear with a single victory. It evolves. It adjusts. And the fight is never truly over. But what Naomi has done, what she has changed, is the perception of what is possible. She has shown that power can be forced to answer. That silence can be broken. And that sometimes, if you push hard enough, even the untouchable can fall. Would love your thoughts on the full arc of the story.